I just can't believe you sometimes, Harry. Ron, Harry and Hermione sat in Professor McGonagall's office. Rain beat against the windows at infrequent moments, peppering the glass with small, hard raindrops. That was a horrible thing you did, Ron added, folding his arms. Just because you fancy her, Ron, replied Harry, bitterly, and he folded his arms and looked at the window. At the very least he was here, and not out in the rain being soaked to death practicing Quidditch. No, said Hermione severely. It was a horrible thing to say, Harry. I don't know whether you've noticed how bad she's been looking, working night after night. It's not just you who can observe Mrs. Frobisher, she added, scorning Harry's look of surprise. Following his outburst towards Cecilia Frobisher in front of not only their Mole Studies class, but other classes in adjacent classrooms, Professor McGonagall had hurried down to uproar in the corridor. Leaving other teachers to deal with the students, she took Harry, Ron and Hermione to her office in Gryffindor Tower amidst protests and objections, and instructing them to remain before swishing out of her office. "Where do you think she's gone?" asked Hermione, looking into the warming, mesmerizing fire as she spoke. Both Ron and Harry turned to look at her. "Home. To see Dumbledore." Harry and Ron exchanged glances and, as suddenly, turned away from one another. Sirius put him up to it. Ron turned his head and spoke to Hermione. Sirius has been filling his mind with his hatred. That's why he did it. "I wanted her out of my life," shot back Harry hotly, turning back and looking at his best friend before staring furiously at the rain on the pane of glass. "Especially after what she'd done," he muttered sullenly. "And what do you think she did?" Ron asked quietly. "Took Lupin off Tonks," said Harry, as if reading from an internal list. "Pried about for information about my family. Raided Sirius's library. Slept with Lupin." He turned and looked at his friends, his expression beseeching. "Slept with Snape, ditched Lupin. And is a thoroughly horrible person." Hermione turned from the fireplace and walked across to Harry, causing him to stop. "And you're sure that everything you've just said is fact?" Harry nodded his head slowly. "Lupin left her after 4 days at Christmas time," said Hermione bluntly. "He didn't tell her why or anything. I asked McGonagall," she added, answering Harry's unspoken question. "Well, that makes sense," exclaimed Ron in realization. "He turned up at Grimmauld Place then, didn't he? And it was full moon a couple of days after." He looked at Hermione and frowned. "But why would the McGonagall tell you that?" "I asked her. I explained I was concerned about Mrs. Frobisher. Apparently, Lupin just went dash." "And how long have you known this?" Harry asked accusingly. Hermione didn't answer. Instead she took a seat by Professor McGonagall's desk and folded her arms. "Does it matter? I told you about rumors. Would you have believed me?" "But Sirius said," Harry began, then fell silent under the furious look Ron was giving him. "We know what Sirius said. So does half the school by now. I think he's gone mad, cooped up in Grimmauld Place for so long. He knows what we're up against, and you in particular, and he's still so against her." He glared at Harry before folding his arms again. "I just don't think I want to be there when he loses another friend because of her prying," replied Harry quietly, resuming his spot by the window. "I don't know exactly what you and Sirius have been talking about, Harry, but if you were spying of Cecilia's personal life, I think that's pretty low." Hermione's cool voice of reason drifted through the office and she gazed towards the fire again. "He asked me to tell him what she was doing," Harry exclaimed loudly. "And you did?" Ron retorted. "You said you were going to check on her work, to make sure it was safe for you. Heavens above, Harry, you know what Sirius is like when he has a grudge." Before Harry had a chance to reply, Hermione looked at him. "And called her Miss Bourne. You threatened her. Hermione's face was a picture of accusation. "I didn't threaten her." "You called her Mistborn." Ron repeated Hermione's words. "That's about as big a threat as you can get, mate." "Mistborn? I don't understand." "Mistborn," said Hermione slowly, getting to her feet. "Imagine Malfoy calling me a mudblood. How would you feel?" "Pretty pissed off and angry," Harry admitted. "Well, imagine that multiplied by 1,000, and a death threat thrown in for good measure," joined in Ron, glancing at Hermione. "It means," continued Hermione, "it's like Ron said, far worse than being called a mudblood. It means you think the person. The mole. Is. An animal." She flung her arms down by her sides emphatically. "Worse than an animal. Like the world would have been better if they hadn't been born." Harry looked between his two friends and sank to a sitting position by the window, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's what you know who and the Death Eaters call each mole they kill. As if the world is much better because they've put to rights someone who was misborn." "Mistakenly born," Ron finished. "It's an old term," added Hermione knowledgeably. "Grown from the good old days where anyone declared misborn was considered fair game for any wizard to kill. And even if no one takes you up on her assassination, you've probably just exposed her as being a mole to the whole school." Harry stood open-mouthed. He couldn't believe it. He had an apostrophe T. He had an apostrophe T. It was terrible. Just then the door opened. "Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall, sweeping into the room and surveying the three wizards, who stood briskly to attention, with a professional eye. "The headmaster would like to see you now." "Sirius Black is a liar and cruel," declared Hermione quietly to Harry and Ron, turning in their direction as she walked through the door towards McGonagall and following the direction of her arm that was gesturing towards the first-floor corridor with her eye. "I'm never going to speak to him again." 88,888,888. Professor Severus Snape stood before Dumbledore, holding a crumpled sheet of parchment in his hands and looking desperately at him. Inwardly, Dumbledore sighed. "Headmaster, I know what you're about to say." Dumbledore held up his hand at Snape's metacognition and the wizard fell silent. "You came by this information through your enchanted Slytherin notebook." Snape nodded, looking urgently at Dumbledore, impatiently waiting for an opportunity to speak. "Let her go, Severus. As she has asked you to." "I need her, Headmaster." "She asks you not to follow her, and that she will be back again." "We should put our faith in Cecilia." Snape took some anxious steps towards Dumbledore's desk behind which he was sitting, his volume increasing. "But she will be in danger now she has left the castle. How are we to be assured of her safety?" "We are not," replied Dumbledore carefully. "However, she is in her own world, she could be anywhere or with anyone. For all we know, she managed to get her automobile working and is heading home as we speak." Snape sighed in frustration. "However, we don't know that." Again, Dumbledore held up a hand. "What does her letter say? Would you read it again, Severus?" Snape bent his head, speaking the words from the parchment aloud. "She told us not to blame Potter." Snape looked up from the letter. "Tell me, Professor, what has Potter done?" Behind the main door of Dumbledore's office, Hermione stopped in the process of stepping on the top step of the spiral staircase as a loud and enraged exclamation reverberated through the thick oak door. Waiting a few moments for the vibrations to die away, she tapped quietly on the door. "Enter." As she did so, she was aware of both Professors Dumbledore and Snape watching her enter, and as Hermione crossed the floor slowly she refused to look away from Dumbledore and at Snape, whose furious glower penetrated the back of her neck. "Good evening, Miss Granger," said Dumbledore kindly. "Thank you for coming up directly. Please sit." He gestured to a chair in the middle of his office. Hesitantly Hermione sat, her mind running through the possible reasons for her being here and coming to the same conclusion. "Now, Miss Granger," I have asked you to speak to us on a grave and urgent matter." Dumbledore steepled his fingers on the desk before him. "Please could you enlighten us as to the incidents that took place during your Mul Studies class this afternoon?" 88,888,888. The train jerked to a stop as its spuffers hit the end plate with a rebounding jolt. The end of the line had come and Cecilia exhaled as she glanced out of the window. The train from Dovetown had finally reached its destination in the small Northumberland town of Blythe. Dozily Cecilia got to her feet, grabbing her bags and departing the train, stepping onto the platform and blinking in the bright electric lights. Around her bustled commuters who had just departed other trains from Newcastle and Durham, taking them home on this dark midweek evening. Cecilia hoisted her bags onto her shoulder, trying to get her mind to register first what she was doing on the platform and once she'd established that, what she needed to do to get to London. Carefully avoiding a young woman with a pair of toddlers who were scampering around their mother, she walked towards the timetable board, around which other passengers were stood, establishing the time and platforms for their trains, and she searched for the main line stations where she would possibly be able to get a nighttime train. "And when we get to the Grenoble Hotel. The conference suite. Athens this year again. We went the last year. But Mum said she'd only be able to look after Tia part-time, so I'll go back to work full-time next year, when she's 5. People around her spoke on mobile phones and amongst themselves as she scanned the boards. 8:45, she thought, noting the time both on her wristwatch and the station platform. And there was a train on platform 2 in 7 minutes that would take her to Newcastle, and from there she was bound to be able to get a mainline train south. She paused in the process of heading off as the voices of the people around her infiltrated her conscious mind. That was what life was supposed to be like. Worrying about work, talking about holidays. Not being attacked by teenage boys with magic spells. Fleetingly the ignorant world of moles flashed in front of her mind. From where she was standing it looked very tempting indeed to bathe in trivialities such as those, and a pang of longing washed over her. A pair of eyes watched as Cecilia hoisted her bags up onto her shoulder before making her way towards the steps that would take her under line 1 and 2 before slowly following her. 88,888,888. At the same time that Cecilia Frobisher boarded the train to Newcastle, Harry Potter stood before Professor Dumbledore, feeling a shudder of remorse pass over him as he ran through his defense. Confidently he looked at Snape before flicking his head back to Dumbledore. "I will come straight to the point, Harry," said Dumbledore slowly, pushing his half-moon spectacles up his long nose. "I need you to answer my questions honestly and accurately." He paused, and despite himself, Harry felt his head nod. "Tell me, what did you do or say to Mrs. Frobisher that made her disappear?" "I attacked her," replied Harry steadily, refusing to take his eyes off Dumbledore as a low growl came from the vicinity of Snape. Dumbledore nodded slowly. "I see. This is indeed a serious matter. To attack a teacher, whether through magical force or by word and deed for whatever reason, is an offense worthy of expulsion from Hogwarts. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Again, Harry did not take his eyes from Dumbledore, even though it felt as if Snape's hot glare was penetrating the back of his head. "No, sir. I lost my temper through personal reasons. And from misinformation." "Misinformation?" thundered Snape, striding forward furiously. "You declared her You declared her to be a mole in front of your peers and most of the school." His eyes bulged with rage as he ferociously pointed out where Harry had erred. "May I ask from whom you got this misinformation, and what it contained?" The question was left hanging in the air as Snape stared at him. Harry looked back at Dumbledore, waiting to see whether that was in fact what the headmaster wanted an answer to, or whether it was Snape's method of admonishment. Dumbledore turned to Snape and smiled slowly. "We will get to that, Professor Snape," he said, glancing back at Harry. I do not think I have to tell you that there may be grave repercussions for the way you addressed Mrs. Frobisher today. I understand there are pressures, but you had absolutely no right to speak to her in the way that you did. Indeed, I have been obliged to call every member of your class, and those from adjacent classrooms who heard your outburst, to my office individually in order to perform a memory charm. As of now, all Hogwarts students, with the exception of Hermione Granger and the Weasley children, believe Mrs. Frobisher to be a squib, which is how I intend it to remain until this work is over. Do I make myself clear?" Harry nodded in hasty agreement. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time before returning the nod. "Now, I would be obliged if you would explain to Professor Snape and myself the reason for attacking Mrs. Frobisher." Harry glanced at the silently furious Snape, who was standing to his left, still wearing an expression of fury. He said nothing. "Miss Granger told me, Harry, that you tried to curse her and to her face accused her of certain indiscretions." At once Harry's eyes flicked across to Snape before looking to the floor, a few inches past his feet. "And whether they took place or not certainly do not pertain to the acquisition of the potion that is under development to be used in the battle." Dumbledore stopped again, allowing the information to sink in. "Don't just stand there, Potter." Snape growled in Harry's direction. "The headmaster asked you a question. What was your reason for attacking Mrs. Frobisher? For your attack was very precise, almost planned. If Mr. Weasley hadn't the wit to knock your hand away, then she would indeed be suffering greatly from her injuries." Again, Harry remained silent, looking back at Dumbledore. "I require an answer, Harry," he prompted softly. Began Harry, glancing at Snape. "She gets on my nerves. I don't like her interfering. She's such a pain. Snooping into my past and questioning me the whole time, like about my aunt and everything. And wanting bits of my mother. And for that, you drove Mrs. Frobisher to leave Hogwarts." Snape's fists were thrust firmly on his hips as he accused Harry. "For all we know, she may never return, either through choice or because you have publicly declared her as a target. Should she never return, we will have lost the best chance we ever had of defeating the Dark Lord for good." Dumbledore shifted in his big oak chair ever so slightly and placed his hands on the leather top of his desk. "Professor Snape is quite correct, Harry. Now, why do you believe Sirius should have killed her?" Dumbledore's question took Harry by surprise. He hadn't been expecting it. He began lamely. "Well, Sirius said." He stopped, noting Snape's expression, but before he had a chance to say something, Dumbledore held up his hand briefly. "Sirius said she was a danger and I shouldn't trust her. Even you said this potion is dangerous. And she's a mole who doesn't have the capacity to understand anything about me." Dumbledore looked down for what seemed like an age. The large, Gothic design clock appeared to stop in its keeping of time. Snape, his arms still folded, stared at Harry in silence. Even the pictures of the former heads of Hogwarts above the fireplace appeared mobile in their frames, as if their paint had finally dried. Eventually he looked up. "Not only have I heard Mrs. Frobisher addresses you, Harry, I have heard the way she addresses you. She is sensitive and so much patience with you. At every turn she has explained what she is doing, and because of this she uncovered and made clear one of the most remarkable links between moles and wizards, something we believed to be lost forever." Dumbledore paused, looking Harry directly in the eye. "A link which is absolutely vital to the weapon. The potion that is being produced, which you have agreed to consume in order to carry out your part in the battle plan. Whatever else Mrs. Frobisher has or has not done is of no consequence to you. Indeed, to any of us." Harry looked down when Dumbledore had finished speaking. He was right. Mrs. Frobisher was here to help. She does what she does for wizards. But that's not strictly true, is it? At the back of his mind, a small voice coursed through his submissive agreement. "I explained to you what the result of this could be, Harry," Dumbledore continued. Are there any questions you wish to ask now regarding the weapon, Harry? Harry looked back at Dumbledore, saying nothing. Maybe the conversations with your godfather have convinced you to think that the Dark Lord will simply disappear of his own accord, Potter. Or maybe you just don't respect her? Maybe you don't respect her. It was Snape's turn to look confused. Harry? Dumbledore steepled his fingers again. I've seen the way you are with her. I saw you touching her. And if that's not disrespect, I don't know what is. Why you? Dumbledore got to his feet quickly as Snape took a step towards Harry. He stopped still and glanced at Dumbledore, who lowered himself to his chair before looking back at Harry. How do you know this? He growled darkly. Well, Harry began, stuttering slightly. Well, me and Ron, we. Go on. Saw you, before Christmas. Saw what? Well, she was in your room, asleep. He stopped, looking in triumph at Snape's horrified expression. You kissed her. Snape said nothing, growing pale and looking down. 88,888,888. The train departed the last stop on the Blythe to Newcastle. Hopefully, just hopefully a train would take her to London tonight, and she would be able to locate the tube station in London where Godric's Hollow stood. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to barricade the tide of thoughts and voices in her mind, which were tossing and turning turbulently. I'm right to do this, thought Cecilia to the powerful tempests that were raging behind her eyes. It's the right thing to do. The people behind her were laughing and joking, giggling and chuckling about something or other, and Cecilia fought the teacher in her to tell them to be quiet, and she gazed out of the window as the lights from the approaching city began to sparkle and flicker as the train got up speed. Meeting Charmaine. Man, then won't we be a sorry sight tomorrow? Cecilia looked at her watch. Nearly 10:15. If she could just get a direct train, the centre of London, and get to the Green Lane tube station, then she could get to Godric's Hollow. And we'll get fare, man. Get a map of the stations and find the town. But she wouldn't be able to get one of those until she got to London. Cecilia watched the lights streak past. Well, that's if she could get there without too much fuss. It wouldn't be long before her disappearance was knowledge amongst the Order, and someone would be trying to find her. And get right pissed into the bargain. Ha ha. Right, Legolas, Oh, why can't you be quiet? You've been like this for the last hour and a half. Cecilia glanced down the carriage at the half-full seats and at her watch. 10:20. It wouldn't matter in a minute. She would be off and on to the next train. She pulled her smaller bag up onto her knees and glanced at the lights again, which were getting denser as the train neared its destination. Someone was bound to be looking for her, whether now or later. Dumbledore wasn't stupid, nor Snape. One of the Order would probably be making their way to Edgeford, and to London. There was probably someone on this train now, following her. As the train jolted over the bogies, Cecilia turned behind her and shivered, wondering if there actually was someone there. It could even be, no. Don't think it. This is your world now. She leaned back and looked at the passengers again. Well, if there was someone there following her, how dare they? She had every right to leave and go where she pleased. The lights dimmed in the carriage for a second as the train began to slow into its approach, and Cecilia swallowed, swiveling on the seat and looking at the passengers who were beginning to rise, sighing deeply and swallowing as she picked up her larger bag from the floor and throwing the shoulder strap of the other over her shoulder. Got to get to London, she thought as she climbed the central steps to the mezzanine level to the timetables, climbing the steps as quickly as possible and ignoring the syncopated oscillation of her larger bag against her thigh. Locating the timetables, Cecilia read them 3 times only to find the next through train would be 4:45 in the morning. Her best bet now, she'd realized would be to catch another so she could get at least somewhere. She didn't fancy waiting around Newcastle Central all night, so perhaps Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield. The next train at this time'll be. The man behind the information desk looked at his watch. In 20 minutes. That'll get you to Sheffield. Cecilia swallowed, looking at him and trying not to react to the panic that was beginning to rise, and nodded. And how much is that? She asked, reaching into her jeans pocket. Return? The man pushed his glasses up his nose in a manner not unlike Cecilia had seen Dumbledore do when he appeared to be concentrating. Single, said Cecilia, pulling out some change. How much is that? The man glanced at a sheet of paper in front of him. Let me see. Single. He turned over a page. £19.80, bet. His voice trailed off as he glanced at the galleon in Cecilia's hand. £19. Cecilia sorted through her change, making a mental note to get some money from the next cash point, thrusting her hand into her pocket again. 20, 40, 50, 70, 80 pence. She looked up at the man, handing him the money in pound coins and silver apologetically. There we are, he replied, handing her the orange and yellow ticket. Platform 4A. Thanks, Cecilia said, taking it before turning and hoisting the bag onto her shoulder. 4A, she thought, scanning the signs above huge hall that displayed the numbers for the platforms. 4A. 4A. As she made her way towards the platform, she heard an announcement. The next train to arrive at platform 4A will be the. Cecilia stopped dead as she heard the staccato announcement over the Danoi. 10 to 55 train to Sheffield, calling at. Cecilia continued to walk towards the platform again, and Harrogate. This train is delayed. Please listen for further announcements. We are very sorry for the delays in this service. Cecilia stopped again, and sighed. Delayed. She looked up at the signboard above the steps down to 4A. The time of the train now had the word written in bold and blinking intermittently next to Sheffield train details. Damn. Well, the only thing she could do now was wait. Cecilia looked down the hall again and, noticing the small newsagents at the corner, realized she was actually a little hungry. £3.7, said the man behind the counter. Cecilia looked down at the sandwich, newspaper and spiral-bound notebook and plunged her hand into her pocket again, trying to leave the galleon behind. Walking out, she glanced up at the screen with the list of trains on again. Delayed. Sighing inwardly, Cecilia made her way to a bench in full view of the screen, looking up again in case the sign had changed before looking down at the paper. Now she was sitting. Cecilia could feel her heart beating faster as she looked back up again. Read this, she told herself sharply. Calm down. Nothing's going to make it come faster. Sit and read this and wait. Turning over the first page, Cecilia glanced down to the second page and looked at the lower article as her mind randomly skipped to the letter she had written to Snape. She looked back down towards the newsagents, hoping he'd got the message. Then, taking one more glance at the display board, she turned back to the article about the young charismatic leader of the opposition who, this paper declared, had a snowman's chance in hell of winning the next general election. 88,888,888. Let me ask you, Harry, you said Mrs. Frobisher was asleep. Harry nodded, dumbly. Dumbledore looked to his left at Snape, who staring rigidly at Harry. He turned back to Harry. Aside from the fact that anything that any teacher in this school does when they are not teaching is a private matter, your actions both this afternoon and by your own admission before Christmas are very grave indeed. Dumbledore was standing up now, and addressing Harry in a cold voice. You were, as Professor Snape indicated, disrespectful to a teacher who is also and a member of the Order. Whatever your personal feelings, Harry, you have done as I warned you not to do. You have allowed your feelings interfere with proceedings. However, it may interest you to know that the night in question was one where both Professor Snape and Mrs. Frobisher elucidated the mystery that had evaded even myself, and if I were to have witnessed the events which you have just described to us, Harry, I would interpret their actions as a jubilant celebration of their success. Now, continued Dumbledore, making it clear that the conversation was closed, can you share with us the reason your opinion of Mrs. Frobisher has changed? Other than she has asked you fairly awkward questions? Black, growled Snape, under his breath, looking at Harry with narrowing eyes. Excuse me, Professor Snape. Black. He spat in Harry's direction, looking down. Black? Oh yes, I see. Dumbledore turned to Harry. Sirius Black has something to do with this? Other than your fervent trust of him? Harry looked down, quickly. Had Sirius betrayed him? Had he lied to him about Mrs. Frobisher and Lupin? Perhaps he shouldn't have given Dobby a letter to alter Sirius about Mrs. Frobisher's disappearance. Harry, I'm asking for your honesty here. Has Sirius Black something to do with your mistrust of her and the work she is undertaking? Harry nodded guiltily. How long have you been communicating information to Black? Harry whipped his head round to look at Snape, who spoke low and soft, announcing Harry's secret aloud. Since the beginning of the year, he confessed, feeling a stab of humiliation in the pit of his stomach. Sirius had been using him for information, hadn't he? He said she couldn't be trusted, that I should watch myself and not allow her to do anything unnatural. Harry looked down, ashamed. Anything else, Potter? It is best we clear up matters now. Harry looked imploringly at Dumbledore, for any sign of redemption. That she dumped Remus after they went off together, because she found out he was a werewolf. Dumbledore raised his huge bushy eyebrows and Harry swallowed, feeling a flush of embarrassment swell on his cheeks. And, well, it seems he was lying. Said Dumbledore, folding his arms and looking at the far humbler young wizard who was standing before him now. Indeed. Lupin and Mrs. Frobisher did indeed part company through his actions. His reasons are his own. Do you understand? Again Dumbledore's words expressed finality, and Harry nodded. He said wizards had died on her behalf. He trailed off as he saw Dumbledore sigh inwardly. Regrettably, this is so. Wizards, 3 from the Order, have died at the hands of the enemy in order to retain and protect Mrs. Frobisher. However, their deaths, these losses, are something we have to bear if we are to stand any chance of defeating the enemy. Do you understand? Yes, sir, he confirmed, glancing uncertainly at Snape, who was wearing an expression of doubt. As a result, her whereabouts are yet unknown. Members of the Order are searching for her, putting themselves in unnecessary danger. Harry looked downcast at Dumbledore's words. I'm sorry, he thought urgently. I am sorry. However, your actions have not been wholly destructive, Harry, added Dumbledore, gliding back round the table and sitting in his chair. Do you know who Joseph Black is, Harry? Harry paused, clearing his head of the last 20 minutes of conversation. Joseph Black. Why did that name ring a bell? As his mind scrolled through his thoughts, a flicker of recognition twinkled at the back. Yes, thought Harry. Yes. He was in Ron's book that Mrs. Frobisher had given to him. Joseph Black was a pure-blood wizard who lived almost 200 years ago. Throughout many years he, and other wizards, liaised and worked closely in collaboration with moles for the future benefit of all. Joseph Black was an ancestor of Sirius, he added, nodding encouragingly. Joseph Black worked closely with a malindustrialist by the name of James Watt? Said Harry in an uplifted tone of realization. Dumbledore nodded. According to legend, Watt worked as a young man with Black, and they developed a close friendship. Once he was established, What improved on the steam engine design originally built by another mole, Newcomen, who in turn had developed this with another wizard. What's development was the beginning of the age that moles call the Industrial Revolution, where mechanized power began to allow moles freedom. However, Watt refused to accredit or acknowledge Black. Infuriated, Black formed together with other enemies of moles, and using the knowledge he had gained through their association, this association is now known as Death Eaters. Dumbledore stopped and Harry sneaked a glance at Snape. They developed a form of magic which allowed whole communities of moles to die with very little effort and leaving very little evidence, which, incidentally, has been solved through the universal link. Began Harry, who was beginning to get lost. So you're saying that one of Sirius's ancestors developed a form of mass murder because he fell out with Watt, and founded the Death Eaters? Dumbledore exchanged a glance with Snape. Black's idea was picked up by Voldemort. He used the name Death Eater because of the use of this magic, for it is highly sophisticated and displays his power very clearly. Indeed, he used it as recently as Halloween. Old magic, said Harry, glancing at Dumbledore sheepishly. Sirius told me, he added. So how does Joseph Black link to Voldemort? What Joseph Black began, Voldemort continued. Do you remember the mole scientists with whom you assisted Mrs. Frobisher before she hit upon the universal link? Harry nodded. Raymond Lully was another ancestor of the Black family, a cousin of Alpard Black. When Joseph Black and later on the Ministry of Magic formally broke off communication with the mole world, some wizards did not, and secretly they worked with scientists for our benefit. Lully was one of them, and he worked quite successfully until, however, he was assassinated at the Goblin riots of 1956, said Harry, astonished. It all makes sense. 88,888,888. Hermione Granger entered the Gryffindor common room and looked around, sighing inwardly. Harry. How stupid. Stupid. Walking across the common room, she huffed as she looked at the couple of students still around. Where was Ron when she needed him? Hermione? Ginny lifted her head from the book she was reading by the fireplace as Hermione glanced from side to side before walking briskly towards the stairs. Quickly she ascended the steps before stopping at the landing. Ron would probably be in bed now, waiting for Harry to return, she thought, looking daringly at the door to the boys' dormitories. And now Mrs. Frobisher wasn't here, she couldn't make any more. Not just yet. Not like there was any reason for them to go gallivanting round the corridors of the school under the invisibility cloak either. But Ron would understand if I pulled him out of bed for a chat, wouldn't he? She needed to speak to him. She wanted to speak to him about everything that was going on. And without Harry. Hermione put her hand on the door of the dormitory, feeling the crackle of the immobilist charm behind her hand that prevented girls from entering, likewise the one on the girls. Hermione? She turned and saw Ginny climbing the stairs, and quickly lowered her wand. The younger girl looked at Hermione's raised wand. What happened? She asked Hermione. What did Dumbledore say? Is Harry expelled? Hermione sagged. That's it then, she thought with a frustrated sigh. No chance of shaking off Ginny and being able to use a counter spell to get in and speak to Ron. It wasn't as if she didn't like the girl. But it was probably a lifetime of growing up with 6 brothers that made her infuriatingly pushy. It was the only way Ginny had probably been able to get involved with them otherwise. Ginny, said Hermione. I don't know. The McGonagall took me in first. She glanced from side to side. Not here, she added, and took a few steps towards the girls' dormitory. Ginny followed her through the door, and down the steps into the bedroom. Jumping onto the bed, Hermione pushed the pillows back towards the headrest and beckoned the younger girl to sit, pulling the curtains round the 4 posters so they could not be seen. Imperturbus. whispered Hermione, and Ginny looked up to see lilac sparks course their way along the bed frame, sealing their area and preventing sound from leaking out of their cocoon. "So," promoted Ginny. "What happened? I heard Harry shouting something this afternoon, but most of our class were in the way." "I think Dumbledore and the McGonagall have been busy with memory charms. No one saw Harry fire the spell at Mrs. Frobisher and heard him call her Miss Bourne now." Hermione trailed off knowingly, watching Ginny's mouth fall open. He's going to be expelled then?" Ginny looked down and round, before back at Hermione, her voice cracking. "Expelled?" Hermione shuffled closer to Ginny, looking at her sympathetically. "I don't know. I don't think so." She shook her head and gave her a kindly smile as Ginny looked up, confused. "The Order need him dash." "They need her too," Ginny replied. "And now she's gone and caused him to get expelled." Hermione picked up Ginny's hand carefully and stroked the back of it. That was the reason she was proactively seeking boyfriend after boyfriend, changing her mind every month or so. She wanted Harry to notice that she was old enough to be a girlfriend to someone. She's old enough to look after herself, even if she can't do magic. "Look, I spoke to Harry. He said he didn't even know what Miss Bourne meant. I think he's sorry, Ginny." The young girl smiled. "Do you think so? I'm just so worried about Harry. I mean, I like him a lot." She glanced at Hermione, "as a friend. I just don't think I could stand it if he died." And to Hermione's surprise, Ginny Weasley began to cry. Big, mournful sobs, and Hermione shuffled forward, holding her shoulders with both hands. "I don't think Mrs. Frobisher has any intention of letting him come to harm, Ginny." 88,888,888. So you see, Potter, life is slightly more complicated than one teacher asking you difficult questions. Is Sirius a traitor? Is that why you're telling me all this? Harry looked at Dumbledore, who was still seated behind his desk and looking grave. He is a confused man. You can understand that, I am sure. Imagine having two very strong influences in your life, Harry, one opposing the other. Sirius decided a long time ago to give up his family's ways, which are those that Joseph Black declared almost 200 years ago. However, you have witnessed the other influence, that which haunts him, deep down, through his blood. To Harry's left, Snape snorted his contempt. Dumbledore glanced in his direction before continuing. I take it you realize what you have done was inappropriate, that you have wronged someone who you should be thanking? Harry nodded earnestly. Why had he listened to Sirius? Maybe he was as dense as Snape had informed him so many times, to blindly go along when actually, he didn't know the facts. Like Hermione had warned. Dumbledore got to his feet, and walked towards Harry, and began to smile. I feel the time has come, Harry, for you to become more involved in the research that Mrs. Frobisher and Professor Snape are undertaking to gain a fuller understanding of the nature of their work. Harry's heart began to beat faster. Fewer lessons? Excellent. In order for you to fit this into your schedule, and indeed to ease the burden on Mrs. Frobisher, you are hereby prohibited from the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Harry felt his face visibly drop, and at the same time a slow smile play on Snape's lips. But sir. And any Hogsmeade visits? When Mrs. Frobisher does not require your assistance, you will report to Professor Snape, who will instruct you further. Is that understood? Grudgingly, Harry nodded. No Quidditch. Well, at least he hadn't been expelled. And at least things began to seem a little bit clearer now. About Voldemort, and about Sirius. You should report to Professor McGonagall and inform her of your change in sanctions, then directly to your dormitory. Is that clear? Yes, Professor. Harry nodded. Professor? Dumbledore looked at him in anticipation. When do I need to start work with Mrs. Frobisher? I should think that would be obvious. Snape was addressing Harry now, his upper lip curling menacingly. Dumbledore took a step back and allowed Snape to speak. "It will be as soon as Mrs. Frobisher returns, which indeed may be never if she has decided to part company with us and return to the Muggle world, or put herself in unforeseen danger and is now dead." Snape folded his arms. "However, if this question is aimed at ascertaining the commencement of your punishment, then the answer is that it begins now." Harry looked immediately from Snape to Dumbledore, his last grain of hope dazzling like a pearl in a river of ebbing silt. "Please inform Professor McGonagall of that information that as of this evening she is short of a seeker," he reiterated. "Now, good night, Harry. And please remember, the conversation we have had here tonight is between only us." Dumbledore looked at him and Snape. "Yes, Professor," he confirmed. "And thank you for not expelling me," he added quickly. "And just to say I'm sorry. I am sorry for my actions, sir." Dumbledore smiled. "Then that should be the first thing you say to Mrs. Frobisher when she returns. Good night." "Good night, Professor," he replied. Turning quickly and with a feeling of elation inside, Harry walked hurriedly towards the door and through it quickly. Pausing on the first step, Harry considered what had transpired in the last 40 minutes. Dumbledore had shared what seemed to be an enormous amount of information with him about not only Mrs. Frobisher, settling his worries, but about the world around him. How many other people, how many other wizards knew about this? About a secret history well buried but that affected everyone today? He was just about to take a step when he stopped as an echo of the subsequent conversation penetrated Dumbledore's office door. "Has made an unfortunate error, Professor Snape, to our advantage. About the change in the plan? Do what must be done. The order will open for all to see. Black." Harry strained to hear the conversation, however the voices were too indistinct. Dismissing what he had heard to the back of his mind, Harry made his way down the spiral staircase until he reached the huge eagle at the bottom. "Indeed, Headmaster," said Snape, walking across the floor of the office and standing before Dumbledore, who had sat back down on his chair. "However, if I leave now, we could save ourselves the trouble of—" Dumbledore raised his hand. "I understand your concern, Professor Snape. Cecilia is dear to us all. We have to trust in her, believe in her. After all she has sacrificed for us, whether she knows it or not. That is what she is asking us to do. However, I noticed that she has become withdrawn. The students have noticed that she has spent more and more time away from them, and more time with you. Some weekends neither of you are not out of the Muggle Studies classroom." Dumbledore looked over his spectacles. "And why should I not give a colleague shelter when she is being treated so abominably by those she is endeavoring to assist? Potter is a case in point." Snape gestured with his arm towards the door. "Minerva informed me 2 days ago that Hermione Granger had been to see her about Mrs. Frobisher's behavior. Minerva herself had begun to have concerns that she had been getting increasingly despondent in the pursuit of this potion. Have you any evidence to suppose that the magic in our environment might be having an adverse effect on her health?" Dumbledore looked at Snape, who nodded knowingly. "Considering the effects of magic on Muggles, it would not be in the least but surprising if we were to discover that the background magic here has begun to affect Mrs. Frobisher. She has been exposed to a medium to high level for a prolonged period of time." Snape took a few steps towards the fireplace. "Although she is a female, perhaps there is a psychological effect. An emotional effect. Black's treatment of her, for example, or Lupin." He turned, looking at Dumbledore with an indescribable expression fleeting across his pallid features. "We have no idea where she may be, Headmaster. No one had discovered her whereabouts." Dumbledore shook his head. "Not the slightest idea. Cecilia Frobisher is in her world now, and despite our powers, it is very easy for a mole to move about in their own world undetected, especially if she doesn't want to be found. However, we do have some idea as to where she may be heading. Snape's face changed from concern to realization. Edgeford, Merlin help her if she decides to go the now. Grimmauld Place, though I doubt that. He looked at Dumbledore. I believe she has reverted to the science of which she's most familiar. Has she mentioned anything, Professor Snape, to make you believe she requires anything above what we can provide in the castle? At his prompt, Snape strode quickly towards his desk, his face determined. Only that for which Black sought to extinguish her life. Dumbledore nodded. She has shown resilience beyond measure, and she has made you what appears to be a very sincere promise. Once we have located her, Professor Snape, the Order will ensure she comes to no harm. I can do that, he snapped, folding his arms in annoyance and looking away from Dumbledore, before slowly turning his head back. However, I can see that other Order members are perfectly capable, Snape continued gravely. For I am needed tomorrow night for my other duty. 88,888,888. Artificial light filtered through Cecilia Frobisher's closed eyes, and as the train came to a clunk and she woozily got to her feet, her smaller denim bag slipped from her lap as the momentum reverberated through the train and she tripped over it before blinking a few times, reaching for the handrail. The Sheffield train had been delayed by almost an hour and a half, and by the time Cecilia boarded it, at midnight, she had read the newspaper 3 times, including the sports section, contemplated another note to Snape telling him where she was, used the notebook to write down what was bothering her the most, done the crossword, attempted the cryptic crossword, read the horoscopes and paced up and down the platform as the chilly late January air infiltrated the enclosed station. Once or twice a supervisor had asked her whether she was all right, in a thick, Geordie accent, and she had moved sides of the platform for a change of post of view. All in all, thought Cecilia, not a very quick or sophisticated getaway, especially if she was being followed. The thought of her being followed had concerned Cecilia greatly as she had settled down on the train when it had finally arrived. No doubt she was being followed or watched, or at least her destination speculated. It was this final thought that Cecilia had on her mind as the rhythm of the train lulled her to sleep and bizarre and surreal images filled her mind in her half-sleep about what she could do to divert attention from herself. The Sheffield station clock displayed the time as being 02:49. Almost 10 to 3, thought Cecilia grimly. Now to find out the next train to London, which was to arrive at 25 to 6 at platform 3. Blinking at the times, Cecilia calculated it would be far better to wait for this train, rather than attempt to get further south on another, for it would take her to Euston, right into the centre of the capital. Making her way towards the waiting room, Cecilia pulled on the door. It didn't move. Behind her, she heard a noise. "It's locked till morning, love," a man in a British Rail uniform said to her. "To stop tramps and the like using it as a toilet and a bedroom." The man's face broke into a smile. "Not that you do that, love. But it's policy. What time's your train?" 5:35, said Cecilia despondently. Following her wait in Newcastle, she didn't really fancy waiting around here for a couple of hours. The man looked at his watch. "There's an all-night cafe that don't mind late travellers waiting, ain't there?" he continued, "as long as yer buy a drink. Or yer could wait on the benches upstairs." Cecilia smiled and nodded. "Thank you," she said, smiling graciously. "I'll try the cafe." 5.35. Then she could get to Green Lane. Cecilia sipped the cheap, hot coffee as she sat in the brightly lit cafe, wondering whether it would have been better for her to have waited at Newcastle after all. She would have had a long wait, but she would be on a direct train. Taking another sip, she looked out of the window at the gloomy street, poorly lit by a handful of sodium streetlights, and glanced at her watch. 3:10. What was she going to do in Sheffield for 2.5 hours? She was tired. And if she stayed here too long, she'd be asleep on the table here in the cafe. Draining the coffee to the bitter dregs, Cecilia got to her feet. The woman behind the counter gave her a smile as she pulled open the glass door with the stainless steel patina door handle and stepped onto the street and began to head back towards the station. So, when I get to Euston, I'll get an underground map and find out where Green Lane is, she thought, walking steadily in the darkness. Then what? Past the station now she walked before pausing and leaning against the low wall that lined the deserted taxi rank. Then Godric's Hollow couldn't be far away. From Lupin's memory, Cecilia recalled it was directly adjacent. Yawning, she glanced at her watch again. 3:20. Perhaps if she went back inside she could sit on the benches as the guard had suggested and wait it out. Yes, I'll do that. Cecilia turned and picked up her bags again, which had suddenly become much heavier than they had been when she had flown out of Hogwarts in a hurry yesterday afternoon. As she made her way back inside she paused as her caught an advertisement for trains to the heart of England, to Birmingham, and her mind ran over the possibility of her catching one. To a normal life, to a magic-free life. To leave this behind her. To run away? No. A voice, firm and clear, rang in her mind. Running away when things get tough. Not when you're this close to sorting it out. As she made her way back into the foyer of the station, lit dimly as it was now, Cecilia considered what she would be doing if she was back at Hogwarts as she sat on the nearest bench and pulled her bags up next to her. Walking down from her room to meet Professor Snape. To the work on the potion, to carry on with the analysis. It seemed so simple now. She was sitting here alone, in the gloom of the empty station. With she looked out of the window. With the concrete tower blocks in the winter darkness just out there. No. She mustn't think like that. If she didn't get Lily's sample, then she would have failed in her agreement with Dumbledore to find the most effective potion for Harry to take to defeat Voldemort in the battle. And she damned well would. Cecilia shivered and looked to her right and left as she considered her position. What would happen when someone worked out where she was? Getting back to her feet, Cecilia made her way outside again. She didn't know what had made her move, but she couldn't sit still. Outside, the cold chill whipped past her and she began to pace towards the cafe again. After just a couple of steps, she stopped again, glancing at the posters advertising the National Express coaches on the hoardings that hung next to the station entrance. Sheffield to London, £18 return. Sheffield to Manchester, £7 return. Bargain, thought Cecilia. Sheffield to Birmingham, £12 return.